Hi there, and welcome to The Calvin Show. I'm Calvin. Let's get started. Today, I want to talk about a book that has completely transformed my life. I love reading, and this one is really special to me. It's called Extraordinary Knowing by a woman named Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer, also known as Lizzie. And let me tell you, so the way I got to hear about this book was I was at the Wisdom 2.0 conference back in, I'm going to say 2012. One of the speakers there was Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a neuroscientist, like a very science guy. And yet we had this conversation about like extra normal phenomena. And he said, you need to get this book and read it. So I got it and read it in basically one sitting. So much amazing stuff in this book. She was, unfortunately passed away now, but she was a PhD in psychology. And she was starting to come across these paranormal phenomena that she couldn't explain. One was her daughter losing a harp. It disappeared, it got stolen, whatever. She enlists the help of a dowser to try and locate this harp. This is before the internet and stuff, and he says, like, send me a map of Toronto or wherever she was living, and then they call the guy on the phone, and then he says, it's on this block. She's like, that's a little too weird. Let me just like put flyers on the entire block, like out to all the houses, and basically saying, hey, we really need this harp. It's a very special instrument. And what happens is that someone calls and it turns out the harp is actually there. And this guy, 3,000 miles away, was able to somehow pinpoint exactly where this harp was located. And she was like, this like messes with everything that I've ever believed in about science and the scientific method. And I need to study this more. The other story was a doctor who was actually like a neurosurgeon. He was starting to get these intense migraines. They realized that the migraines had started at the time that he stopped teaching. He was working at a university hospital, so part of his job was to teach what he knew. But at one point, he'd started to feel so uncomfortable teaching because he felt like he couldn't share and teach people what was really going on. His method was this. He would sit at the bedside next to his patient and just wait until he saw this like white light around the person's head. And once he saw that light, he knew it was safe to operate. And if he didn't see that light, he wouldn't operate on him. And he felt like a crazy person. And he felt like if he started to tell his students this, he would get kicked out, or they would look at him as if he was crazy. She put together a group of, I believe, around 60 scientists, PhDs from all kinds of different fields, to meet up every so often and discuss these phenomena and try to get a better understanding of what was really going on with a like scientific method, but knowing that something had to change in how we were looking at this scientifically. She made it a requirement for entry into this group that everybody shared some personal experience with paranormal phenomena. You couldn't have lurkers who were just going to sit in there and like listen and then expose and ridicule people. All these people didn't feel safe sharing these stories and these experiences with each other for fear of being called a quack or a crazy person or not being taken seriously in the scientific community. Yet so many people had these experiences. Clearly, something is broken in the scientific system and the scientific method if you can't share these actual, experiences that you've had. The book is filled with amazing stories. One of my favorite is the story of Freud. She talks at one point to someone who was living at the same time as Freud and remembered how he actually was. One of the disagreements that Freud had with Jung was around the collective unconscious and how we're all connected at a deeper level, through our unconscious in a way that kind of traditional science doesn't address. Freud actually was on board with this, but he felt like his theories were far out enough, as it were, so he was like, don't talk about this stuff. Freud was actually, he was terrified of of music. He would feel like it would transport him to a place of kind of transcendence, and he felt very, very uncomfortable. And so he would, whenever music was being played, he would slip out of the room and just try to get away from it. He was afraid of that transcendent feeling that we can all experience when we meditate, or when we kind of feel deeply connected with the universe in some way, in nature or whatever. And Freud was personally scared of this place and was holding on to this more like mind-based approach that he taught us. The entire world here, more than 100 years later, is kind of still mostly stuck in what he produced, that was driven so much by his fears, rather than embracing some of the deeper realizations from Jung about how we're all connected. We have the rational mind, which functions in a nice little linear, almost Newtonian fashion. And then we have our unconscious mind, which is way bigger and which is not predictable in the same way. It's like jump ball dreams, do weird things, and it's not really predictable. These people in her group notices kind of the similarity between the macro Newtonian level and the Einsteinian level, which is of physics, which is much more unpredictable. The more that you try to nail down every single parameter, the more you kind of force reality into a more Newtonian principle. So you have to, if you're going to look at these things, you have to look at them in a non-deterministic way. And so we have to develop new scientific methods for approaching all of this. One thing that I remember Dan Siegel talked about specifically was how everything exists on a continuum from 100% certainty to 0% certainty over here. You can kind of choose where you want to be, but if you choose 100% certainty, then your life is going to be like very locked down and rigorous, and there's no room for magic or for this dance with the universe. Whereas if you allow yourself to be on the other side, where there's like no certainty at all, then you're completely in the moment. What we want is to be able to move freely in between those aspects. Like sometimes it's really good to know that like this is the table, I'm here, my boundaries, I'm getting in the car, I'm going to drive here. And other times it's really useful to let go of that and let the universe play its part. I would say especially in this country, in America, is there's this desire for certainty, but there can never be 100% certainty. So it's always going to fail. And what we lose in the process of trying to do that is massive. We lose life essentially, right? Whereas an approach to healing that's not about the certainty so much, but allowing spontaneous healing, there's going to be less certainty. Things may go wrong in certain ways. That turns out to be very, very costly at times. So dance with that, between the certainty and the uncertainty. At one point in the book, Lizzie mentions an intuitive that she worked with named Deb Mengeles, or Debbie. My wife and I, we reached out to her and we started working with her, and we've spent time with her, and she's incredible. And she was the one that actually taught me a lot about accessing intuition and working with that. The way to develop yourself intuitively is to heal all of your emotional gunk from growing up. All of these areas where we have stored up emotions, these are areas where we're numbed out, either not feeling anything, or we get triggered and we feel too much, but we're not in tune with our intuition because these things are blocking access to the intuition. So I point like this because to me, intuition is, it's the gut feeling. It's based in the gut. There are actual neurons, there are actual brain cells down there. People talk about the skull brain and the heart brain and the gut brain. These are three separate brains that we have that operate together. And if your digestion is completely fucked, then you're not going to have that access to your gut brain, and it's going to impact all kinds of areas in your life. She talks about in the book here, she talks about, I know, and yet I know that I don't know. She talks to a poker player who's like, how do you know, whether to draw or whatever they do in poker? How do you, and he's like, I know, and yet I know that I don't know. It's that kind of knowing where you're just like, I just know this, and intellectually, rationally, I know that I don't really know it. I have no basis of really knowing it, but in here, in my gut, I know. It's challenging at times. Is this a head thought knowing? Is it I want this to be true? Is it a fear-based, oh shit, I know this is gonna or is it like a knowing? I like to think of it as increasing your resolution. You know, I remember when I was starting to like really getting into photography and taking a lot of pictures, it changed how I look at the world around me, because I was looking for scenes and framing it and just noticing things. I was like, oh, that would be a good picture. And is that kind of like, as we go around about our lives, focusing on this, the resolution increases. We're able to see things more clearly, kind of like what Victor talked about the other day, that he can see much more clearly now. That's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of The Calvin Show. Make sure you go to the website, sign up for the mailing list. I will email you as soon as there's a new episode, and it's up here probably. You can respond to any of those emails with your questions. You can also post your question in a comment. You can post a comment telling me what you think about this episode. See you next time. And remember, what's the worst that can fucking happen?